My name is Jack Winters, and I never thought I'd return to Mount Hood. Yet here I am, driving our old Winnebago up these winding roads with my 17-year-old daughter Liz beside me. She's been quiet for the last hour, just clicking away with her camera at the endless pine trees passing by our window. Dad, look. Liz suddenly points to a gap between the trees. That's where you used to work, right? The old ranger station? I grip the steering wheel tighter. The abandoned building sits there like a ghost from my past. Its windows dark and empty. 20 years of search and rescue work in these mountains. And I thought I'd seen it all. Until that day 2 years ago when I lost Sarah, my wife Liz's mom, in these very woods. But we're not here because of Sarah. Not directly, anyway. We're here because Dr. Victoria Palmer, a scientist studying local legends, went missing 3 weeks ago. Her last known location? The same area where Sarah vanished. Dad, you're doing that thing again, Liz says softly, lowering her camera. That thing where you get all quiet and broody. I force a smile, just thinking about where to park this beast. I lie, patting the Winnebago's dashboard. But truthfully, something feels different about the forest today. The air seems thicker, and the shadows between the trees look deeper than they should. As we round the final bend to the campground, I spot Sheriff Matthews' patrol car. He's standing there, hands on his belt, watching us approach. But it's the old Native American man next to him that catches my eye. Benjamin Redfeather, or Old Ben as everyone calls him. I haven't seen him since Sarah's funeral. The sun is setting behind Mount Hood, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. But something about those colors seems wrong, unnatural. Liz must notice it too because she's taking picture after picture. Dad, she whispers, checking her camera screen. The photos, they're showing something weird in the trees. I park the RV and look at her screen. Among the normal sunset shots, there's one that makes my blood run cold. In the spaces between the trees, where there should be nothing but darkness, there are shapes. Impossible shapes, and they seem to be watching us. This was supposed to be a simple missing person case. But as I look at those shapes in Liz's photo, I realize we've just stepped into something much bigger, much older, and much more dangerous than I could have imagined. And somewhere in these eternal pines, something is waiting for us. The sun had completely set by the time we finished setting up camp. Our Winnebago sat in a small clearing, surrounded by those tall, dark pines. I was making coffee when Sheriff Matthews knocked on our door. "Evening, Jack," he said, but his usual friendly smile was missing. "Mind if I come in?" I noticed how tired he looked, like he hadn't slept in days. As he sat at our small dining table, Liz kept glancing at him while pretending to organize her photos. "3 more hikers went missing yesterday," Matthews said quietly, stirring his coffee. "Same area as Dr. Palmer. They just vanished. No tracks, no equipment left behind, nothing. Just like Mom," Liz whispered. And the RV fell silent. A soft tap on the window made us all jump. It was old Ben, his weathered face serious in the dim light. "You shouldn't be here," well, he said as I let him in. "The forest, it's different now." "Wrong? What do you mean wrong?" I asked, but part of me didn't want to know the answer. Old Ben picked up one of Liz's photos. His hands were shaking. "The Watchers," he said. "They're awake. Those shapes you captured, child, our people have known about them for centuries. They guard something in these woods, something that should stay hidden." Suddenly, all the lights in the RV flickered. Outside, the wind picked up, making the trees creak and sway, but there was something else, a sound like whispers, but not quite human. "Did you hear that?" Liz asked, moving closer to me. Sheriff Matthews stood up so quickly he knocked over his coffee. "I should go," he said, but his face had gone pale. "Jack, whatever you do, don't go into the forest at night. And those photos your daughter took, burn them." As Matthews hurried out, old Ben stayed behind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Wear this," he told Liz. "It protected our people in the old days. You'll need it now." That night, none of us could sleep. The whispers outside grew louder, and the trees seemed to move even when there was no wind. Liz kept checking her camera, showing me how the shapes in her photos were getting clearer, closer. At midnight, we heard a scream from deep in the forest. It sounded like Dr. Palmer's voice, but somehow wrong. like it was coming from very far away, or maybe from everywhere. Liz grabbed my arm. Look at the windows. I did, and my heart nearly stopped. The forest outside our RV didn't look the same anymore. The trees seemed older, twisted, and in the spaces between them, shadows moved in ways shadows shouldn't. That's when I realized we weren't just looking for a missing person anymore. We were dealing with something that had been waiting in these woods for a very, very long time, and it knew we were here. I woke up to Liz shaking my shoulder. The RV was freezing cold, even though I'd left the heater on all night. "Dad, wake up. Something's wrong with time," she said, pointing to her phone and then to my watch. Her phone showed 7 a.m., but my watch was stuck at midnight. The clock on the RV's dashboard was spinning backward. I rubbed my eyes and looked outside. What I saw made no sense. The same sunrise was happening over and over, like a video on loop. Every few minutes, the sky would go dark, then light again. "We need to find Dr. Palmer," I said, trying to stay calm for Liz. "But first, let's check on Sheriff Matthews." We walked to where his patrol car had been parked last night. The car was there, but it looked different. Older, rusted, like it had been sitting there for years. Inside, we found Dr. Palmer's research diary. As I flipped through the pages, my hands started shaking. The last entry read, "They're not just watching anymore, they're changing things. Time isn't working right. I see myself walking through the same parts of the forest, but I'm different in each one. I'm younger, older, sometimes I'm not even me anymore." A twig snapped behind us. We turned to see old Ben, but something was wrong. He looked younger, maybe 50 years younger. "You're seeing it now, aren't you?" he said. "The forest doesn't just hold secrets, it holds different times, all happening at once. Look there." He pointed to a clearing, and we saw something impossible. 3 different versions of Dr. Palmer were walking through the same space. One looked scared, one was taking notes, and one wasn't quite human anymore. "Dad," Liz whispered, holding up her camera. "The shapes in my photos, they're not just watching us, they're changing things. Look." The pictures showed the truth. Those dark shapes were reaching out, touching people, places, time itself, and with each touch, things changed. Suddenly, we heard Sheriff Matthews' voice calling from 3 different directions. Each voice was telling a different story, like 3 radios playing at once. "We need to go back to the RV," I said, but when we turned around, our Winnebago wasn't where we'd left it. Instead, we saw it parked in 3 different spots, each one looking like it was from a different year. "Which one is ours?" Liz asked, squeezing my hand. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we need to choose one, now." The forest was getting darker, even though it was supposed to be morning. Those shapes from Liz's photos were moving between the trees, getting closer, and somewhere in the distance, we heard Dr. Palmer screaming again. But this time, it sounded like she was screaming in 3 different voices at once. We had to make a choice. But how do you choose the right path when time itself has gone wrong? We chose the middle RV, the one that looked most like ours. As we ran towards it, I saw something that made my heart stop. Through its windows, I could see another me sitting at the table, and another Liz taking photos. "Don't look inside," I told Liz, pulling her back. "We need to find Dr. Palmer first. She's the key to understanding what's happening." Just then, old Ben's voice came from behind us, but it wasn't the young old Ben we'd just seen. This was the old Ben from last night, looking his real age again. "The Guardians are closing in," he said, his voice shaking. "They've been waiting for someone like your daughter, someone who can see them, capture them in pictures. They need her." "Why?" I asked, stepping in front of Liz protectively. Before he could answer, Sheriff Matthews stumbled out of the trees. He looked terrible, like he'd aged 20 years overnight. "I have to tell you something," he gasped. "I've been keeping secrets about these woods for 30 years, about what really happens here." He pulled out an old leather journal. "This was my grandfather's. He was sheriff here in 1890. The disappearances, they've been happening for over 100 years. But it's not just people vanishing, they come back, changed. A scream cut through the air. Lon, Palmer again. But this time, we could tell where it was coming from. Without thinking, I started running toward the sound, Liz right behind me. We found Dr. Palmer's camp after a few minutes. Her tent was there, but it looked like it had been there for both a day and 50 years at the same time. Inside, her research was scattered everywhere, and on her laptop, still running somehow, was a video. Liz pressed play. Dr. Palmer appeared on screen, looking scared. "I know what they are now," she said in the video. "The Guardians aren't monsters, they're time itself. They protect the forest by keeping all times happening at once. But something's gone wrong. The times are mixing together, and they need someone to fix it." The video crackled, and suddenly we were watching a different Dr. Palmer, her eyes strange and glowing. "They chose me," she said. "But I failed. Now they want someone else. Someone younger. Someone who can see them naturally." The laptop screen went black, but not before we saw something moving behind Dr. Palmer in the video, one of those dark shapes, reaching for her. "Dad," Liz whispered, grabbing my arm. "Look at my camera." The photos she'd taken were changing right before our eyes. In each one, those dark shapes were getting clearer. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were like tears in time itself, showing all the different versions of the forest at once. And they were all around us now. "Run," I shouted. But when we turned around, we saw something impossible. 3 different versions of ourselves were running in different directions, and behind each version, the forest looked completely different. One was in daylight, one in night, and one in a time that didn't look like any time at all. We had to choose which version of ourselves to follow, but choose wrong, and we might end up lost in the wrong time forever. The Guardians were closing in. We had to decide. Now, we followed the version of ourselves that was running into the night forest. I held Liz's hand tight as we ran, the ground shifting beneath our feet. Every few steps, the trees around us changed, young, old, ancient, and back again. "Stop." It was Dr. Palmer's voice, but not the scared one from the video. This Dr. Palmer stepped out from behind a tree, her eyes glowing with a strange blue light. She looked both young and old at the same time. "Elizabeth," she said, looking at Liz, "they've been waiting for you, just like they waited for me, but I wasn't strong enough to hold the times together." Suddenly, Sheriff Matthews appeared, but 3 of him at once. The young sheriff from the 1990s, the current one, and an old man we hadn't met yet, Jack. All 3 sheriffs said together, "I'm sorry, I should have told you the truth when Sarah disappeared. She found them too." The Guardians showed her everything, but, what? I demanded, my voice shaking. "What happened to my wife?" Before he could answer, old Ben appeared, walking with a cane made of shifting wood. "She became part of the forest," he said softly. "Part of all times. The Guardians tried to make her their anchor, but she wasn't the right one. They need someone born with the ability to see them. Someone like me," Liz whispered, squeezing my hand tighter. The air around us grew thick and heavy. Those dark shapes from Liz's photos were everywhere now, moving closer. But they weren't scary anymore. They were beautiful in a strange way, like windows into different times. "Dad," Liz said, her voice changing. "I can see Mom." I looked where she was pointing. There between the trees was Sarah Myas, but not just one Sarah. I saw her as a young woman when we first met, as she was on our wedding day, and as she looked the day she disappeared. "The forest is breaking," Dr. Palmer said urgently. "All the times are falling apart. Elizabeth has to make a choice. She can become the new anchor, holding all the times together, or everything falls apart." The 3 sheriffs finished. Liz looked at me, tears in her eyes. "Dad, I know what I have to do, but I'm scared." I hugged her tight, feeling like my heart was being torn in 2. "Whatever you choose, I'm with you." "Actually," old Ben said, "that's not quite true. The Guardians are offering a trade, a daughter's life for a father's memories. Jack, you can save Liz, but you'll forget everything. Sarah, this forest, even your own daughter." The shapes moved closer, their edges glowing. Through them I could see every version of this moment playing out. In some, I lost Liz. In others, I forgot everything. And in a few, something even stranger. Dad, Liz said, her voice stronger now. I know what we have to do, but you have to trust me. The forest held its breath. Time itself seemed to wait for our answer. And in that moment, looking at my brave daughter, I knew exactly what I had to do. I took a deep breath and looked at my daughter. We do it together, I said firmly. The Guardians want to trade? Here's my offer. Both of us or neither of us. The shapes in the forest froze. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Dad, are you sure? Liz asked, holding up her camera one last time. Through its screen, we could see what the Guardians really were. They were like pieces of time itself, glowing and shifting. Your father is either very wise or very foolish, Dr. Palmer said, her glowing eyes widening. This has never been done before. 2 anchors instead of 1. Suddenly, Sarah appeared in front of us. Not just one version of her, but all of them at once. She smiled, and I knew we'd made the right choice. The forest doesn't need a single anchor, Sarah said softly. It needs a family. That's what I was trying to tell them when I disappeared. Love is stronger than time. The Guardians moved closer. I could feel them now, not scary anymore, but sad and lonely. They'd been holding this forest together for so long, all by themselves. Ready? I asked Liz, holding out my hand. She nodded, taking my hand. Ready, Dad? The moment we both agreed, everything changed. The forest lit up like it was full of stars. I could feel every time at once. Nidast, past, present, future, modded, didn't hurt. Instead, it felt like finally understanding a story that had been confusing for too long. Look, Sheriff Matthews gasped. Nidast, all 3 versions of him pointing at us. Liz and I were glowing now, just like Dr. Palmer, but different. Where she glowed blue, we shone with a warm golden light. The forest seemed to sigh with relief. The perfect solution, old Ben said, smiling. A father's protection and a daughter's sight working together. Dr. Palmer's glow began to fade. She looked human again, tired but happy. They're letting me go, she said. They have what they really needed now. The forest around us settled into a new pattern. We could still see all the different times, but now they were gentle, like layers of a painting instead of a mess of confusion. So what happens now? Liz asked, looking at her hands that still held a soft golden glow. Now, Sarah's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. You both become part of the forest story, but you'll still be you. You'll still have your lives, your memories. You'll just be a little bit more. I looked at my daughter and saw she was crying, but smiling too. We can still go home, she asked. The forest is home now, old Ben said gently. But not your only home. You're not prisoners. You're guardians. The forest will call when it needs you. The shapes, the original guardians, seemed to bow to us before fading into the trees. They weren't gone just resting. After centuries of holding time together alone, they finally had help. Sheriff Matthews stepped forward, just one of him now, the present one. I'll help keep your secret, he said, both of you. It's the least I can do after keeping secrets for so long. As the night settled around us, Liz and I walked back to our RV, the real one, in the right time. We were different now, but still ourselves. Still father and daughter, but also something more. Guardians of time, protectors of the forest. And somewhere in the eternal pines, Sarah was watching over us, proud of her family, who had finally found their true purpose. The forest had its anchors at last, and we had each other. 1 month later, I'm sitting in our Winnebago, watching Liz make breakfast. Everything looks normal. The sun is shining, birds are chirping outside. But we both know we're different now. Dad, look, Liz points out the window. Through our new sight, we can see gentle waves of time flowing through the trees like a peaceful river. No more chaos, no more fear, just the forest breathing in its own special way. Dr. Palmer visits sometimes. She's back to her research, but now she studies the forest with our help. She's different too. Calmer, wiser, like someone who's seen the truth and found peace with it. Sheriff Matthews keeps our secret. When hikers go missing now, Liz and I help find them. It's like my old search and rescue job, but with a twist. We can see which time they've wandered into and guide them back. Old Ben teaches us about our new role. Being a guardian isn't just about watching time, he told us yesterday. It's about protecting stories, the forest stories, people's stories, all of them. The best part, we still see Sarah, not all the time, but in quiet moments when the forest's times overlap just right. She's proud of us, she says. Proud that we found a way to keep our family together across time itself. Ready for patrol? Liz asks, putting away the breakfast dishes. She's wearing old Ben's leather pouch around her neck. Not for protection anymore, but as a reminder of how our story began. I nod, grabbing my old rescue whistle. We don't really need it now, but some habits are worth keeping. Let's go check on our forest. As we step outside, the morning sun shows us all the layers of time at once, past, present, and future woven together like a beautiful tapestry. And we're part of it now, keeping it safe, keeping it balanced. We're still Jack and Liz Winter. We still have our normal life in town. But here, in these eternal pines, we're something more. We're guardians, protectors, keepers of time. And somewhere in these woods, in all times at once, our family story continues. My name is Rick Donovan, and I never thought I'd be telling this story. Even now, my hands shake as I type these words. What happened in the boundary waters of Minnesota last summer changed my life forever. Nearly cost me everything I hold dear. I've been a forest ranger for almost 15 years now. The woods have always been my escape, my safe place. That was until the divorce hit me hard 6 months ago. Sarah, my ex-wife, got custody of our 12-year-old daughter Emily, leaving me with weekend visits and this hollow feeling in my chest that just wouldn't go away. Emily used to be my little shadow, always following me around with her stuffed deer, Mr. Antlers, and asking questions about every tree and bird we saw. But lately, she's been different. Quiet, distant. Her teachers called about her falling grades, and Sarah mentioned she wasn't sleeping well. I guess divorce does that to kids. That's why I decided to take Emily on our first father-daughter trip since the split. I had this old 1976 Winnebago Chieftain, not the prettiest thing you've ever seen, but it had character. Emily used to call it our adventure mobile when she was younger. I thought maybe, just maybe, a weekend camping trip could help us find our way back to each other. I remember picking her up that Friday morning. She climbed into the RV without a word, clutching Mr. Antlers in her backpack. The silence hurt, but I tried to stay positive. Ready for an adventure, kiddo? I asked, trying to catch her eye in the rearview mirror. She just shrugged, staring out the window as we pulled away from Sarah's house. Whatever, Dad. I didn't know it then, but that ordinary Friday morning was the beginning of something terrifying. Something that would test not just our survival skills, but our bond as father and daughter. And it all started when that old Winnebago began making strange noises somewhere deep in the boundary waters, miles from any help. If I had known what was waiting for us in those ancient pines, I might have turned around right then. But I didn't. And that's where our real story begins. The first sign that something was wrong came when the RV started making this weird clanking sound. You know that feeling when you know something bad is about to happen? Yeah, that's exactly how I felt. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in dark orange, and we were miles away from any town. Dad? Emily finally spoke up, her voice small. What's that noise? Just the old girl being cranky, I said, trying to sound confident. But inside, I was worried. The engine started coughing, then spluttering, and finally, just died. We rolled to a stop on a narrow forest road, surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to stretch forever into the darkening sky. I tried starting the RV again and again, but nothing happened. Just that awful clicking sound. Great. Just great. Looks like we're camping here tonight, kiddo, I said, pulling out my flashlight and ranger map. The weird thing was, I couldn't exactly pin down where we were. The road we were on didn't seem to match any on my map. which was strange because I knew these woods like the back of my hand. Emily hugged Mr. Antlers tighter. I don't like it here, Dad. Something feels weird. Was about to tell her everything was fine when I noticed something odd. The trees around us had these strange markings carved into them. Not your usual heart with initials kind of thing, but old twisted symbols that made my skin crawl. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like them. As we set up camp for the night, I tried calling for help on my ranger radio. All I got was static and these strange whispers that almost sounded like words played backward. I didn't tell Emily about that part. "Hey, want to help me make some hot chocolate?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. But Emily was staring out the RV window, her face pressed against the glass. "Dad," she whispered. I think I saw someone watching us from the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out into the darkness. The beam caught something that made my heart skip. A deer carcass, arranged in a perfect circle with stones around it. That definitely wasn't normal wildlife behavior. Just then, a howl echoed through the forest, but it wasn't like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. It sounded wrong, almost human, but not quite. Emily grabbed my hand. "Can we lock the doors, Dad? Please." I didn't argue. As I checked all the locks, I noticed the temperature had dropped dramatically. Our breath was coming out in white puffs, even though it was the middle of summer. That was just the beginning of our first night in those woods. And trust me, things were about to get much, much worse. I couldn't sleep that night. Every little sound made me jump, live in the trees, branches scratching against the RV's roof, and those strange howls that kept getting closer. Emily finally fell asleep on the small bed in the back, still holding on to Mr. Antlers. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Mival footsteps. Heavy footsteps, circling our RV. They weren't animal footsteps. They were too deliberate, too slow. I grabbed my flashlight and ranger pistol, peering out through the curtains. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a really tall tree, but trees don't move. And trees definitely don't have antlers or glowing eyes. This thing had to be at least 12 feet tall, skinny as a skeleton, with skin that looked like old gray bark. When it turned its head toward the RV, I dropped to the floor, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. "Daddy?" Emily's voice came from behind me. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, sweetie," I whispered, motioning for her to stay quiet. "Just thought I heard something." But Emily wasn't listening to me anymore. She was staring at the radio on the counter, which had suddenly come to life. Through the static, we could hear voices, but they were all wrong, like someone playing a tape backward. Then Emily said something that chilled me to the bone. "They're hungry, Daddy. They've been hungry for so long." "Who's hungry, Em?" "The ones who walk between the trees. The old people used to feed them, but now they're angry because everyone forgot about them." I was about to ask her what she meant when my phone rang. The screen showed Sarah's number, my ex-wife, but that was impossible. We had no signal out here. I answered it anyway. "Rick?" Sarah's voice came through, but it sounded distant, echoey. "Rick, come outside. I need to show you something important." Emily grabbed my arm. "Don't, Dad. That's not Mom." The footsteps outside got louder. Something scraped against the RV's door and the whole vehicle shook. The temperature dropped so low that frost started forming on the windows. In the middle of summer. That's when we heard another voice. My best friend Marcus. "Rick, you in there? I got your distress call, but I hadn't made any distress call. And Marcus wasn't supposed to be on duty tonight." Emily started crying. "They're trying to trick us, Dad. They want us to open the door. Please don't open the door." Morning came after what felt like the longest night of my life. The strange voices had stopped, and the footsteps were gone. But something was different about Emily. She sat at the RV's small table, drawing the same symbols we'd seen on the trees over and over in her notebook. Honey, where did you learn these?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "They showed me in my dreams," she said, not looking up. "They say we're on their feeding ground. They want us to stay." Before I could respond, We heard a real car engine approaching. Through the windshield, I saw Marcus's green Ranger truck pulling up. This time it was really him, and I could see his familiar red baseball cap and the coffee thermos he always carried. "Rick, what are you doing out here?" Marcus called out, walking toward us. "This area's been closed off for weeks. Didn't you see the signs?" "What signs?" I hadn't seen any closure notices. Marcus looked confused. "The ones about the missing hikers. 3 people disappeared here last month. We found their campsite. It wasn't pretty." As Marcus checked under the RV's hood, Emily tugged at my sleeve. "Dad, something's wrong with Uncle Marcus," she whispered. She'd always called him that, even though we weren't related. I looked closer at my friend. His movements seemed off, like he was trying to remember how to act normal, and his eyes kept darting toward the trees. "The engine looks fine," Marcus said, wiping his hands. "But you should both come back to my truck. It's not safe here." That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Marcus's shadow on the ground didn't match his movements. It was longer, twisted, with what looked like antlers. Emily saw it too. She grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard. "Thanks, Marcus," I said carefully, "but I think we'll wait for the tow truck." Marcus's face changed, just for a second. His smile got too wide, showing too many teeth. "I insist," he said, his voice deeper than normal. "The hungry ones are waiting." I slammed and locked the RV door just as Marcus, or whatever was pretending to be Marcus, lunged forward. His hands left black marks on our window, like they were covered in some kind of dark slime. Emily started speaking in a language I'd never heard before. Her eyes rolled back in her head. The thing outside that looked like Marcus began to change shape. What happened next still gives me nightmares. The thing that looked like Marcus started to stretch, literally stretch, until it was as tall as our RV. Its skin turned gray and rough, like old tree bark, and those antlers I'd seen in the shadow grew right out of its head. This wasn't Marcus. It had never been Marcus. Emily was still speaking in that strange language, her voice getting louder. The temperature inside the RV dropped so fast, I could see our breath. Frost spread across the windows like spider webs. "Emily," I shook her shoulders gently. Come back to me." Her eyes snapped open. "Dad, I know what they want," she said, her voice shaking. "They've been here for thousands of years. They need a bridge. Someone young who can connect their world to ours. They want me." The creature outside let out a horrible scream that sounded like metal scraping on metal. More shapes emerged from the trees. Tall, skinny figures with antlers, all moving toward our RV. I counted 6 of them. Then I remembered something. In the ranger station's old logs, I'd read about similar incidents from the 1800s. The local tribes had a ritual to ward off these creatures, but it required a sacrifice, something precious that connected you to your past. My hand went to my wedding ring. Even after the divorce, I'd kept wearing it, unable to let go. Emily noticed what I was doing. "The ring, Dad," she said. "They're showing me. It has to be burned with sage at sunrise while saying the words they taught me." "But sunrise isn't for hours," I said, checking my watch. It was only 2 p.m., but the sky outside had gone dark as night. "They can control time here," Emily explained, still shivering. "They've been playing with us since we arrived, making us see things, making us hear things." The creatures were now completely surrounding our RV, their long fingers scraping against the metal. Each scratch left trails of that black, slimy stuff that smoked when it touched the ground. I found an old sage bundle in my Ranger first aid kit. We used it for smudging ceremonies sometimes. As if on cue, the eastern sky began to lighten. The creatures were giving us our sunrise. Emily took my wedding ring and the sage. She started chanting those strange words again, but this time she seemed in control. As the first ray of sun hit the ring, she dropped it into the burning sage. The screams that followed were unlike anything I'd ever heard. The creatures started thrashing around, their long limbs whipping through the air. The black slime on our RV began to bubble and steam. Emily kept chanting, her voice getting stronger with each word, while I held her shoulders to keep her steady. Suddenly, There was a flash of light so bright it felt like lightning had struck right next to us. When I could see again, the creatures were gone. The forest was quiet, normal quiet, with birds chirping and wind in the trees. The sun was really rising now, and the temperature was back to normal. "Dad?" Emily's voice was back to normal too. "Are they gone?" Before I could answer, we heard a weak voice calling from the trees. "Rick?" It was Marcus Pons, the real Marcus this time. We found him about 50 feet from the RV, lying on the ground, confused but alive. He couldn't remember anything after getting a strange call about us needing help. The RV's engine started right up, like nothing had ever been wrong with it. As we drove away, Emily kept looking back through the rear window. "They're still there, Dad," she said quietly. "They're just sleeping now, but they'll wake up again someday." We never found my wedding ring in the ashes of the sage, but sometimes, when Emily and I go camping now in a tent, never an RV, she can point out symbols in the trees that I can't see. And sometimes, just sometimes, we hear distant howls that make us pack up and head home early. The strangest thing, every time we get home from these trips, we find a small mark drawn in black on our tent or car, like the creatures are reminding us they're still watching, still waiting. I've learned 3 important things from all this. 1. Some parts of the forest should be left alone. 2. Not all family bonds can be broken, even by monsters. 3. Never ignore your kid when they say something feels wrong. Emily's doing better now. The divorce doesn't seem to bother her as much. She says after facing those things in the woods, regular life problems don't seem so scary anymore. But she still keeps Mr. Antlers close, and neither of us goes into the woods alone. As for me, I still work as a ranger, but I make sure to respect the old warnings and signs, and every time I hear about strange noises in the boundary waters, I make sure to steer people away from certain areas. Some stories shouldn't have sequels. My name is Mike Harrison. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but some things need to be shared, even if they sound impossible. 3 years ago, I returned from Vietnam with more than just medals and scars. The nightmares followed me home, turning my nights into battles I couldn't win. My wife Rebecca, bless her heart, tried everything to help me. Being a nurse, she understood trauma better than most. But even she couldn't chase away the demons in my head. Our 8-year-old son Tim, well, he's always been different. Sees things others don't, feels things deeper than most kids his age. It was Rebecca's idea to take a break from everything. "Let's go camping," she said one morning, after another rough night of me waking up screaming. The redwood forest, just us 3. Fresh air, nature, peace, and quiet. I remember how her eyes lit up when she showed me the brochure of Blood Moon Valley, a remote spot in Northern California where the trees touched the sky. We bought this old 1969 Dodge Travco RV Mises, a real beauty, after I fixed her up. Tim named her Ladybug because of her rounded shape and the red paint job. Looking back now, I wish we'd picked any other place, any other time. But you can't change the past, can you? What happened in Blood Moon Valley during those 7 days changed us forever. Some nights when the moon is full and red, I still hear the howls, still see those things. But I need to tell this story from the beginning, from that sunny afternoon when we first drove into the valley, not knowing we were heading straight into a nightmare. Tim saw it first. He always sees things first. "Dad," he said from the back of the RV, his voice small but serious, "something's wrong with this place." I should have listened to him right then, but when you're a grown-up, sometimes you forget that kids can see what we can't. Let me tell you about our week in Blood Moon Valley, about the old man named Luther, who tried to warn us, about the things that wear your loved ones' faces, about how sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones you fought in war but the ones waiting in the darkest parts of America's wilderness. This is our story, and I swear on my military service, every word of it is true. The drive into Blood Moon Valley started like any other camping trip. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange, and the giant redwood trees made shadows that looked like long fingers on the road. Rebecca was humming along to the radio, and Tim was quiet in the back, pressing his face against the window. "Dad, can we stop for a minute?" Tim asked suddenly. "I need to stretch my legs." I pulled the RV over near a small clearing. That's when I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no crickets, nothing. Just the sound of our engine cooling down. "Mike, look at that." Rebecca pointed to something carved in a tree. It was old, really old. Some kind of symbol that looked like a twisted moon with claw marks through it. I'd seen enough warning signs in Vietnam to feel my stomach tighten. Tim walked up to the tree and touched the carving. "It's warm," he whispered, pulling his hand back quickly. "And it feels sad." I was about to tell him it was just his imagination when we heard it. A long, low howl that didn't sound quite like a wolf. Rebecca grabbed Tim's hand and I felt my old military instincts kick in. "Let's get back in the RV," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But before we could move, an old man appeared from between the trees. He moved so quietly, I hadn't heard him coming. And that's saying something for someone trained in combat. "You folks headed to the camping grounds?" he asked. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in a while. He wore old clothes and had a long gray beard, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Yes, we are," Rebecca answered. "I'm Rebecca. This is my husband Mike and our son Tim. Name's Luther Wilson," he said, looking at each of us carefully. "You might want to reconsider camping here. Blood moon's coming in 3 days. Valley ain't safe during blood moon. I've heard my share of local legends and crazy warnings, but something about the way Luther said it made my skin crawl." Tim moved closer to me, grabbing my hand, something he hadn't done since he was 6. "Dad," he whispered, "Luther's telling the truth. Can't you feel it?" Before I could answer, Luther pulled something from his pocket, an old piece of newspaper. "Last blood moon, 3 hunters went missing. Never found them. Well, not all of them anyway." He handed me the paper, his hand steady despite his age. The headline read, "3 missing in Blood Moon Valley. Only clothes found." I handed the paper back, trying to stay rational. "Look, Mr. Wilson, we appreciate the warning, but we've driven a long way. Your choice." He cut me off. "But if you stay, come find me at the north end of the valley if things get strange. And whatever you do, don't trust what you see when the moon turns red." He disappeared back into the trees as quietly as he'd appeared, leaving us standing there with more questions than answers. Rebecca looked at me, worry clear in her eyes. "Mike, maybe we're staying," I said firmly, even as my gut told me otherwise. "It's just local superstition. We came here to heal, remember?" As we got back in the RV, I caught Tim looking back at the carved tree. "Dad," he said quietly, "the carving's bleeding." I turned quickly, but in the growing darkness, the tree looked normal. Just an old carving on an older tree. But why did my hands shake as I started the engine? We found a nice spot to park the RV near a small stream. The trees were so tall here, they almost blocked out the sky. I tried to focus on normal things, setting up our camp chairs, helping Rebecca organize our supplies, watching Tim explore nearby, but not too far. That first night seemed normal enough. We had hot dogs for dinner, and I even managed to smile when Tim made silly shadows with his flashlight. But around midnight, things changed. I woke up to Tim shaking me. "Dad, someone's crying outside." At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it too, a sound like someone sobbing, but it wasn't quite human. Rebecca was still asleep, so I grabbed my flashlight and Tim's hand. "Stay in the RV," I whispered to him. "No, Dad, we need to stay together," he insisted, his small face serious in the darkness. Something in his voice made me listen. We looked out the RV window together. The moonlight made everything look silver and strange. That's when we saw it, Nickel of deer standing about 20 feet from our RV. But something was wrong with it. It was standing on its hind legs, like a person. "Dad," Tim whispered, squeezing my hand tight, "that's not a real deer." The creature turned its head toward our window too quickly, too sharply. Its eyes reflected our flashlight, not the usual green shine of animal eyes, but a deep, blood red. Then it smiled. "Deer don't smile," I switched off the flashlight immediately, pulling Tim away from the window. My heart was pounding like it did in the war. We heard footsteps outside the RV, slow, deliberate steps, like someone walking on two legs, circling our vehicle. Rebecca woke up then. "Mike, what's wrong?" I put my finger to my lips. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. Tim whispered something I'll never forget. "It's trying to decide which one of us to look like." The door handle started to rattle. I held my family close, trying to remember what Luther had said. "Don't trust what you see, but what do you do when what you see shouldn't exist at all?" The rattling stopped suddenly. Then we heard a loud whistle from somewhere in the forest, and the sound of something running away, not on four legs, but on two. None of us slept for the rest of the night. When morning came, we found deep footprints around the RV, human footprints that turned into deer hooves halfway through each step. Rebecca looked at me, her face pale. "Mike, maybe we should listen to Luther." I nodded slowly, looking at the strange tracks. "Yeah, but first we need to understand what we're dealing with." "Tim, what did you mean about it trying to look like us?" Tim was staring at the forest. "They're skinwalkers, Dad. Luther knows about them. We need to find him before the blood moon comes. I've faced enemies before, but at least in Vietnam, I knew what I was fighting. Here, in this peaceful-looking valley, something was hunting us, and we had 3 days until the blood moon to figure out how to survive it." We decided to look for Luther that morning. I didn't like the idea of wandering through the forest, but staying put felt worse. Rebecca packed her medical kit nigh. She always said better safe than sorry. Tim held on to his favorite flashlight, even though it was daytime. As we walked, I noticed things that made my soldier instincts scream. Dead birds lying in perfect circles, trees with bark peeled off in neat surgical strips, and the silence. No forest should be this quiet. "Look." Tim pointed to a tree. There was another one of those moon carvings, but this one was different. It seemed to have been made recently, the wood still fresh and pale. "Luther's leaving us a trail," I realized. "He wants us to find him." We followed the carvings deeper into the valley. That's when we heard the humming Wunnergradi, a low, steady sound that made my teeth hurt. Tim covered his ear. "Someone's coming," he whispered. Through the trees we saw a woman walking. She was wearing a white dress, and something about her looked familiar. Rebecca gasped beside me. "Mom," she said, her voice shaking. That's impossible. Mom died 3 years ago." The woman turned toward us, and my blood went cold. She looked exactly like Rebecca's mother, but her movements were wrong. Jerky, like a puppet on strings. She smiled, showing too many teeth. "Rebecca, honey." The thing said, "Why didn't you save me at the hospital?" Rebecca started to step forward, but Tim grabbed her hand. "That's not Grandma," he said firmly. "Look at her feet, Mom." We all looked down. The woman's feet were backward. "Run," I shouted, grabbing both Rebecca and Tim. We ran as fast as we could, hearing that thing laugh behind us. A laugh that turned into a howl. Just when I thought we couldn't run anymore, we burst into a small clearing. There was a cabin there, and Luther was standing on the porch with a rifle. "Inside, quick," he yelled. We rushed in, and Luther slammed the door behind us. The cabin was small but filled with strange things. Silver knives, dried plants, and more of those moon carvings. "You saw one of them, didn't you?" Luther asked, watching us catch our breath. "They like to wear the faces of dead loved ones. Makes it harder to fight them." "What are they?" Rebecca asked, still shaking from seeing her mother's face on that thing. "Skinwalkers. Ancient evil. They live in this valley, hunting during the blood moon." Luther looked at Tim. "But your boy here, he can see through their disguises." "That's rare." Tim nodded. "They look blurry to me, like a TV with bad reception." Luther started pulling out maps and old books. "You've got 2 choices now. Leave the valley today or stay and fight. But if you leave, they'll follow. They've got your scent now." I looked at my family. Rebecca was holding Tim close, but I could see the strength in her eyes. Tim looked scared but determined. Me? I was tired of running from my nightmares. "We fight," I said, "but you need to tell us everything you know." Luther nodded grimly. Then we better get started. The blood moon rises tomorrow night, and they'll be hunting in force. As Luther began to explain, we heard more howls in the distance, closer this time, and they weren't just animal sounds anymore. They were starting to sound like voices we knew. Luther spent the next few hours teaching us how to survive. His cabin was like a fortress against skinwalkers. Salt lines at every window, silver charms hanging from the ceiling, mirrors everywhere. They hate seeing their true form, he explained. First rule, Luther said, laying out silver bullets on his table. They can't copy the living, only the dead. Second rule, they can't cross running water. Third rule, they're strongest when the moon is red. While Luther talked, Tim sat by the window, drawing in his notebook. They're getting closer, he said quietly. I can feel them. Suddenly we heard voices outside, voices I recognized. My old war buddies, the ones who died in Vietnam. Mike, help us, Mike. We're hurt. I felt my hands shake. Rebecca grabbed them, steadying me. It's not real, she whispered. Remember what they really are. Luther handed me his rifle. Silver bullets, aim for the heart or head. They don't die easy, but they can die. Then Tim screamed. Through the window we saw the Maya's figures walking backward, wearing faces of people we'd lost. My war buddies, Rebecca's mother, Luther's wife, but they weren't right. Their movements were twitchy, their smiles too wide. They're trying to get us to come out, Luther said. Night's falling. Soon the moon will rise. Rebecca started setting up a medical area in the corner. If we're going to fight, we need to be ready for injuries. Her nurse training was kicking in, keeping her focused. I watched the sun sink behind the trees, my military training coming back. We need to secure the perimeter, I said. Tim, you're our early warning system. You see anything weird, you shout. They're changing, Tim said, pointing outside. The figures were shifting, their bodies twisting in ways that shouldn't be possible. Bones cracking, skin stretching. Luther loaded his gun. Blood moons rising. Get ready. The cabin started shaking. The voices outside turned into howls. Through the windows we saw the moon rising, eyes big and red as blood. Dad, Tim said, his voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. They're coming, but they're scared too. Scared of us. Rebecca held up a silver knife. Luther aimed his gun. I took a deep breath, thinking of all the battles I'd fought, but this one was different. This time I was fighting for my family. The door began to rattle. The first attack came through the window. Glass shattered as something that looked like a mix between a person and a deer crashed through. Luther fired immediately. The silver bullet hit it square in the chest, and it screamed in a voice that sounded like my old sergeant from Vietnam. Down, I yelled, pulling Tim under the table. Rebecca threw a jar of salt, creating a barrier between us and the creature. It couldn't cross the line, but more were coming. Mike, the back door, Luther shouted. I turned to see something wearing Rebecca's mother's face trying to pick the lock. Its fingers were too long, bending in impossible ways. I aimed and fired, but it moved like smoke, disappearing and reappearing. Tim grabbed my arm. Dad, they're trying to separate us. That's how they hunt. He was right. The creatures were pushing us into different corners of the cabin. Luther was by the front door, Rebecca near the medical supplies, Tim and me by the table, each of us surrounded by shifting shadows. Then I heard Rebecca scream. One of them had grabbed her ankle, pulling her toward the broken window. I ran to help, but another creature blocked my path, this one wearing the face of my best friend who died in my arms in Vietnam. Should have saved me, Mike, it said, grinning with sharp teeth. You're not him, I said firmly, remembering Luther's training. I fired twice, and it dissolved into black smoke. Tim's voice cut through the chaos. The mirrors, make them look at themselves. Rebecca grabbed a hand mirror from Luther's wall and thrust it at the creature holding her. It shrieked when it saw its true reflection. A twisted, dark thing with too many limbs. Its grip loosened, and she scrambled away. Luther was fighting like a man possessed, shooting and throwing silver charms. The moon's almost at its peak, he shouted. That's when they're strongest. The cabin was chaos. Shadows moving everywhere, faces of the dead appearing and disappearing, horrible sounds that were half animal, half human. But we stayed together, watching each other's backs. Then Tim did something brave and terrifying. He stepped into the middle of the room and held up his flashlight, the one he'd been carrying all day, but now it was wrapped in silver chains from Luther's collection. "I see you," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I see what you really are." When he clicked on the light, something amazing happened. The beam reflected off all Luther's mirrors at once, filling the cabin with silver light. The creatures screamed, not with stolen voices, but with their real ones. They sounded ancient and angry and afraid. But we weren't safe yet. Not even close, because outside something bigger was coming. Something that made even the skinwalkers go quiet. "The Queen," Luther whispered. "She's here." The whole cabin went silent. Even the skinwalkers backed away from the windows. Through the broken glass, we saw her Luth. The Queen. She was tall, taller than the cabin itself, with a body that kept changing shape. One moment she looked like a giant deer, the next like a woman, then something I can't even describe. "Nobody move," Luther whispered. "She's older than this valley, older than the redwoods." But Tim stepped forward again. "She's sad," he said. "She's so old and so lonely." The Queen's face appeared at the broken window. She had no fixed features, just shadows that moved like water. When she spoke, it sounded like 1,000 voices at once. "The child sees truth," she said. Her words made the cabin shake. "Hugh, give him to me. I need one who can see." "No," Rebecca and I shouted together. I pulled Tim behind me, but he squirmed free. "Dad, wait," Tim said. "I know what to do." Before I could stop him, Tim held up his flashlight again, but this time he didn't turn it on. Instead, he started talking to the Queen. "You don't have to be alone," he said. "You don't have to hurt people to be seen." The Queen's form rippled. "You know nothing of loneliness, child. Centuries watching humans come and go, forgetting us, forgetting the old ways." Luther raised his rifle, but I put my hand on it. "Wait," I whispered. "Trust Tim." Tim took another step forward. "I see you," he said. "Not just what you look like, but who you are. And I'm not afraid." Something strange happened then. The Queen's shifting form became clearer, more solid. She looked almost human now. Meld woman with sad eyes. "No one has spoken to me like this in centuries," she said, her voice softer now. "They only run, or fight, or die." "Because you scare them," Tim said simply. "You don't have to." Rebecca moved to stand beside Tim. "We came here for healing," she said. Maybe you need healing too." The Queen was quiet for a long moment. The blood moon hung above us, painting everything red. Then she reached out one hand, a normal human-looking hand, and touched Tim's flashlight. "Your light," she said. "It doesn't hurt like the others. It sees without burning." Luther lowered his rifle completely. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered.
See. Key.
"In 40 years I've never..." Suddenly all the skinwalkers around us started changing. Their twisted forms smoothed out. Their stolen faces faded. They looked more like people now, Myas. Sad, lost people. The Queen straightened up. Perhaps it is time for change. Time to remember who we were before the hatred, before the hunger." She turned to Luther. "Old hunter, lay down your weapons. The valley's nature is changing tonight." I felt something shift in the air. The heavy feeling that had been pressing down on us since we arrived started to lift. Tim smiled. "They're not going to hurt anyone anymore, Dad," he said. "They just needed someone to see them. Really see them." But we weren't quite done yet. The blood moon still had plans for us that night, and the valley had one more test before it would let us go. Just as we thought everything was calming down, the ground started shaking. The Queen's face changed. Not scary this time, but worried. "The valley," she said urgently. "It's rejecting the change. The old magic is fighting back." Cracks appeared in the cabin floor. Dark smoke started seeping up through them. forming shapes that looked like hands reaching for us. "Everyone out," Luther shouted. "The cabin's not safe anymore." We ran outside into the blood moon's light. The forest around us was transforming. Trees were bending in impossible ways, their branches trying to grab us. The ground kept shaking, and that horrible humming sound from before came back, louder than ever. "Tim!" Rebecca screamed. One of the smoke hands had wrapped around his ankle, trying to pull him into the ground. I grabbed Tim's arms, pulling with all my strength. Rebecca held on to me, and Luther grabbed her. The queen watched, her form flickering between human and something ancient. "The valley wants a sacrifice," she said. "It's always needed one during the blood moon." "No," I shouted, still holding Tim. "You said things were changing." Tim looked up at the queen, even as the smoke tried to drag him down. "You can stop this," he said. "You're part of the valley too." The queen seemed to grow taller. "I am old," she said. "But the valley is older. Its hunger is deeper." That's when Luther did something none of us expected. He let go of Rebecca and stepped forward. "Take me," he said to the valley. "I've hunted your children for 40 years. Let me make it right." "Luther." "No," Tim cried. But Luther smiled. "It's okay, kid. Sometimes the old has to go so the new can begin. Just promise you'll remember me." Before we could stop him, Luther walked straight into the biggest crack in the ground. The smoke hands let go of Tim and grabbed Luther instead. The queen bowed her head. "Brave hunter," she whispered. "Your sacrifice is accepted."
Key.
The ground started closing up. The trees straightened. The humming stopped. Luther looked at us one last time, still smiling, and then he was gone. Tim ran to the spot where Luther disappeared. He placed his flashlight there, wrapped in Luther's silver chains. "The valley will remember him," the queen said. "As will I." His sacrifice broke the old curse. Rebecca held me tight, crying. I looked at where my son stood, brave and strong, and realized something, Neeson. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't won with guns or violence, but with understanding and sacrifice. The blood moon started to fade. Morning was coming, but there was still one more thing we needed to do before we could leave Blood Moon Valley. As the sun started to rise, the queen led us through the forest one last time. The skinwalkers followed quietly, looking more human with each step. They weren't scary anymore, just sad, like people who'd been lost for a very long time. We reached Luther's cabin, or what was left of it. The queen touched the broken walls, and they fixed themselves. "This will be a place of peace now," she said, "a bridge between your world and ours." Tim walked inside and picked up Luther's old journal. "Dad, look," he said, showing me the last page. Luther had written something just yesterday. "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting monsters, but understanding them." Rebecca started gathering Luther's silver charms. "We should keep these," she said softly. To remember him. That's when I noticed something strange. My hands had stopped shaking. The war memories that usually haunted me felt distant, less painful. The valley had changed me too. "The healing you sought," the queen said, looking at me. "It came in an unexpected way, didn't it, soldier?" I nodded, unable to speak. She was right. I'd come here running from my demons, only to face different ones. And somehow, that had helped. Tim placed Luther's journal on a shelf and turned to the queen. "Will you be okay now?" he asked. She smiled, a real warm smile. "Yes, child. Your light showed us another way. The valley will still have its magic, but no more hunting, no more fear." The skinwalkers began to fade into the morning mist, not disappearing completely, but becoming part of the forest itself. The queen touched each of our foreheads gently. "Go now," she said. "Tell your story to those who need to hear it. But remember, some will believe, some won't. That's the way of things." As we walked back to our RV, the forest felt different. Birds were singing again. The trees looked normal, but if you looked carefully, you could see small silver charms hanging from branches, protecting both worlds. We packed up quietly. Before leaving, Tim placed his flashlight wrapped in Luther's chains on a tree stump. "For the next person who needs to see," he said. Driving away from Blood Moon Valley, I looked in the rearview mirror. The queen stood at the forest's edge, raising her hand in goodbye. Then she faded into the morning light, becoming one with the ancient redwoods. Rebecca squeezed my hand. "You okay?" she asked. I thought about it. The nightmares from Vietnam might not be completely gone, but they felt different now. "Yeah," I said, "I think I am." From the back seat, Tim spoke up. "Dad, can we come back someday?" I looked at the valley one last time in the mirror. "Maybe, son. But next time not during a blood moon." We all laughed. A real laugh, the kind that heals. As we drove away, I realized some battles aren't about winning or losing. They're about understanding. And sometimes, the monsters we fear the most are just lost souls looking for peace, just like us. My name is Thomas Morrison, and I've spent my entire life chasing mysteries that most people laugh at. But what happened in Olympic National Forest last summer changed everything I thought I knew about science, nature, and reality itself. I'm a cryptozoologist, fancy word for someone who studies creatures that might not exist. My latest research brought me and my 15-year-old daughter Allison to Washington State in our old 1983 GMC motorhome. I'd turned it into a rolling laboratory, packed with all sorts of equipment to track and study unusual creatures. Allison wasn't happy about missing summer camp, and she made sure I knew it every chance she got. "Dad, this is so stupid," she said for the 100th time as we drove through the towering trees. "We're going to waste the whole summer looking for Bigfoot again." I glanced at her slumped in the passenger seat, her face buried in her phone. "This time is different, honey. The pattern of sightings here goes back 30 years. Something's really happening in these woods." That's when we met Peter Walsh, the Forest Service guy who'd be our guide. He seemed nice enough, but there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. Later that day, we also met Catherine Running Bear. Everyone called her Kit, a local tribal elder who took one look at our RV and shook her head. "The hungry ones won't like this," she warned, her weathered face serious. "They don't like machines in their forest." I smiled politely, used to local legends, but Allison perked up for the first time since we arrived. "The hungry ones?" she asked. Kit nodded slowly. "Ancient spirits. They protect the forest, and they're always watching." I didn't know it then, but those words would turn out to be our first warning of the terror that awaited us in those ancient woods. As we set up camp that first evening, I noticed something odd about the trees around us. They seemed to form perfect circles in places, like someone or something had arranged them that way. And when the sun set, the forest got so quiet it felt like the woods were holding their breath. That was just the beginning of our story. If I'd known what was coming, I would have turned that RV around and never looked back. But science was about to meet something it couldn't explain, and my daughter and I were caught right in the middle of it. Our first week in the forest started normally enough. Each morning I'd check the equipment while Allison stayed in the RV, usually reading or texting her friends when we could get a signal. But things started getting weird on Wednesday morning. I was checking the motion sensors when I found them. Footprints. Not just any footprints, but huge ones, 18 inches long. They were so clear in the mud that I could see every detail. My hands shook as I took photos and made plaster casts. "Allison," I called out, "come look at this." She came trudging over, still in her pajamas. Even she couldn't hide her surprise. "Dad, those are really big." While we were studying the prints, Peter showed up. He looked at them for a long time, his face going pale. "When I was a kid," he said quietly, "I saw something in these woods, something big. Never told anyone about it." That same day, our equipment started picking up strange sounds, too low for human ears to hear, but our machines could detect them. It was like a deep humming coming from all around us. But the really strange stuff started happening when Allison met the deer. She came running back to the RV one afternoon, her eyes wide. "Dad, you won't believe what I just saw. There was this deer, but its eyes, they were glowing, like actually glowing." I thought she was exaggerating until I saw it myself that evening. The deer stood at the edge of our camp, perfectly still. Its eyes shone like green flashlights in the dark. When it looked at us, I felt like it was trying to tell us something. That night, I found some old documents in Peter's truck when he wasn't around. They were from the 1950s, talking about scientists who had gone missing in these exact woods. When I asked Peter about them the next day, he got nervous and changed the subject. Kit visited us again, bringing some tea and warnings. "The trees," she said, pointing around our camp. "They're closer than they were yesterday." I laughed it off, but later that night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what she said, so I got out my camera and compared pictures from when we first arrived. My stomach dropped. The trees were closer. Somehow they had moved. Allison started having nightmares. She'd wake up screaming about the tall ones watching. I told her they were just dreams, but deep down I was starting to wonder. Every morning our equipment showed strange readings, and the forest felt different, like it was alive and aware of us. I'm a scientist. I don't believe in monsters or magic, but after that first week, I couldn't explain what was happening anymore. And the scariest part? This was just the beginning. That night, as we sat in our RV listening to the strange sounds outside, I realized we were in way over our heads. Something was out there in the darkness, something that didn't want us here, and it was getting closer. The second week changed everything. It started when Allison woke me up in the middle of the night, shaking. "Dad, they're talking to me," she whispered, her face white as a sheet. In my head, "They want us to leave." I was about to tell her it was just another nightmare when I heard it too. Not with my ears, but in my mind. It was like whispers in a language I didn't know, but somehow understood. The feeling made my skin crawl. That's when we saw them. Through the RV windows we could make out huge shapes in the darkness, at least 9 feet tall. They moved like shadows between the trees, surrounding our camp. The weird part was, they seemed to fade into the trees, like they were part of them. All our equipment went crazy. The computers flickered on and off, showing strange patterns. The radio kept switching channels by itself, playing bits of static and old songs. Even our phones started acting up, showing the same message over and over, "Leave now." Peter came running to our RV that night, looking scared for the first time since we'd met him. "Dr. Morrison," he said, catching his breath, "there's something you need to know. I'm not really just a Forest Service worker." But before he could finish, the trees around us started moving, not swaying in the wind, but actually moving their branches like arms reaching for us. The ground shook, and roots burst through the soil, wrapping around our RV's tires. Kit appeared out of nowhere, holding some kind of smoking bundle of herbs. "They're not what you think they are, Thomas," she said urgently. "They're not Bigfoot. They're the ancient guardians of this forest, and they're angry." She explained how these beings had protected the forest for thousands of years. They could control the plants, talk without speaking, and even change their shape. But now, they were mad because humans were destroying their home. "The government knows," Peter finally admitted. "They've known since 1955. I was sent here to watch you, to see if you'd find anything. There's a whole team of us." I felt betrayed and scared. All my research, everything I believed about Bigfoot, it was something completely different. And now my daughter was somehow connected to these beings. That night got worse. The creatures came closer than ever. Through the windows we could see their glowing eyes, just like the deer Allison had seen. The trees kept moving, making a cage around us. The air felt heavy, like right before a storm. "Dad," Allison said, holding my hand tight, "they're showing me things, terrible things that happened here, and things that are going to happen." Kit started preparing something she called an ancient ritual, saying it was our only chance. Peter kept making frantic calls on a special radio he'd hidden. We were trapped in our RV, surrounded by things we couldn't explain, with a government agent we couldn't trust, and a forest that seemed to want us dead. The worst part? I had a feeling this was just the calm before the real storm. As the night got darker, we could hear more of them gathering outside. The forest wasn't just hungry anymore, it was ready to feast. Everything fell apart the next day. It started when a group of government vehicles rolled into the forest, black SUVs with dark windows, Peter's real team had arrived. They want to capture one of them, Peter told us, looking guilty. They think these beings could be used as weapons. That's why I've been watching you all this time. But the forest had other plans. We watched in horror as vines shot out of the ground, wrapping around the SUVs like giant snakes. The agents barely had time to scream. The trees bent down, their branches moving like fingers. And then, I don't want to describe what happened next. Let's just say those agents never made it back to their base. The forest is protecting itself, Kit said calmly, lighting sacred herbs in a circle around our RV. But it needs a sacrifice to restore balance. That's when we found the missing hikers from last month. They were standing at the edge of the clearing, but something was wrong. Their skin looked like bark, their fingers like twigs. They had been turned into trees. Allison grabbed my arm. Dad, they're showing me everything now. The government's been taking people from this forest for years, trying to understand the Guardian's power. That's why they're so angry. Peter tried to run. I'll never forget the sound of his scream as the vines caught him, pulling him into the darkness between the trees. His radio crackled one last time before going silent. Kit looked at us with sad eyes. There's only one way to end this, she said. The forest needs a willing sacrifice. Someone to become part of it forever, to show that not all humans want to destroy it. Before I could stop her, Kit walked into the middle of the clearing. She started singing in her native language, her voice getting louder as the forest creatures gathered around her. The air filled with a strange green light. Close your eyes, Kit told us. Don't watch what happens next. We did as she said. There was a bright flash, even through our closed eyes, and when we opened them, Kit was gone. In her place stood a beautiful old tree, its leaves shimmering with the same green light we'd seen in the deer's eyes. The forest grew quiet. The angry presence we'd felt for days seemed to calm down. Through tears, Allison told me she could feel the Guardians accepting Kit's sacrifice. They would leave us alone now, but we had to spread their message. The forest needed to be protected, not exploited. As we packed up the RV to leave, I looked back at Kit's tree. For a moment, I thought I saw her face in the bark, smiling peacefully. The jade pendant she had given Allison glowed softly, a reminder that we now carried a piece of the forest's magic with us. We drove away as the sun rose, leaving behind a forest full of secrets. But this wasn't the end of our story. It was just the beginning of our mission to protect what Kit had died to save. Sometimes, late at night, Allison still talks to them in her dreams. And sometimes, when I look out into dark woods, I see glowing eyes watching, reminding me that there are things in this world that science can't explain, things that need to stay wild and free. 1 month later, we were back home, but nothing felt the same anymore. The jade pendant Kit gave Allison still glowed sometimes, especially at night. My daughter had changed. She was quieter, more serious, and spent a lot of time looking at trees. I tried writing up my research, but how do you explain something like this to the scientific world? My computers were full of data, photos, and recordings, but they didn't show the whole truth. They couldn't capture what it felt like to see trees move like living creatures or hear voices in your head. Strange things started happening at our house. Plants grew faster in our garden. Birds and animals would gather in our yard, watching us. Sometimes, late at night, we'd hear that familiar deep humming sound, like the forest was checking on us. One evening, Allison called me to her room. "Dad, look," she said, pointing to her window. Outside, a deer stood in our backyard, its eyes glowing that same green color we'd seen in Olympic Forest. It nodded at us once, then disappeared into the shadows. "They're spreading," Allison whispered. "The Guardians are moving to other forests. They want us to help protect them." We got a letter from the Forest Service saying Peter Walsh had gone missing, presumed dead, but we knew the truth. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear his voice in the rustling leaves, warning others to stay away. The government team never came after us. Maybe they were too scared, or maybe the forest guardians had scared them enough. Either way, we kept quiet about what we'd seen, except for sharing Kit's message: the forests need protection. I still do research, but different now. I look for signs of the guardians in other forests. Allison helps me, using her special connection to guide us. We found similar stories all over the country. Places where the trees seem alive, where people hear strange whispers, where animals act unusually intelligent. Last week, we got a package. Inside was Kit's old journal, filled with stories about the forest guardians. We don't know who sent it, but the last page had a new message written in fresh ink. The hungry ones are watching. They remember their friends. That night, looking out at the trees behind our house, I saw something move between them, something tall and ancient. But I wasn't scared anymore. The forest had taught us its secret. Nature isn't just alive, it's aware, and sometimes when you respect it, it protects you back. Allison says we're part of the forest family now. Maybe she's right. Every time I see a tree moving in ways it shouldn't, or hear whispers in my mind, I remember Kit's sacrifice and the promise we made to keep the forest's secrets and protect its guardians. Because now we know, in every dark forest behind every ancient tree, the hungry ones are watching, and they're counting on us to make sure their story gets told the right way.